On page 138, he talks about liberty versus socialism, but it's not quite the socialism you might think. And you may know that John Stuart Mill did eventually endorse socialism, but again, it's not quite the kind of socialism that's usually discussed today. I only hoped that by universal education leading to voluntary restraint on population, the portion of the poor might be made more tolerable. In short, I was a Democrat, but not the least of a socialist. We were now much less Democrats than I had been, because so long as education continues to be so wretchedly imperfect, we dreaded the ignorance and especially the selfishness and brutality of the mass. But our ideal of ultimate improvement went far beyond democracy, and would class us decidedly under the general designation of socialists. While we repudiated with the greatest energy that tyranny of society over the individual, which most socialistic systems are supposed to involve, we yet looked forward to a time when society will no longer be divided into the idle and the industrious, when the rule that they who do not work shall not eat will be applied not to paupers only, or poor people, but impartially to all, when the division of the produce of labor, instead of depending, as in so great a degree it now does, on the accident of birth, will be made by concert on an acknowledged principle of justice, and when it will no longer either be, or be thought to be, impossible for human beings to exert themselves strenuously in procuring benefits which are not to be exclusively their own, but to be shared with the society they belong to. So you can see certainly some concerns that John Stuart Mill had at the time, which pushed him over to more left-leaning or more redistribution of wealth, more management of more economic management. But you also notice, and that makes him a little more educated and more intelligent than modern socialists, that there is a great fear of the state or the masses of the community dictating and enslaving, you could use any kind of negative term, the liberties of the individual. That is kind of one of the more basic criticisms of a socialist system, in which what kinds of privacy and freedom of action does an individual have under such a system. Often that value is devalued by socialists, because their value, they have a greater value at stake for them. They think it's a greater value. They see differences in the rich and poor, as you see John Stuart Mill kind of outlining here, saying things like people who are born into wealth, the accident of birth, he says, accident of birth, and I think he's discussing when he says people who that idea, if you don't work, you don't eat. I think he might be suggesting that people who actually are born into wealth and then don't work and sit idle, they shouldn't be able to be idle. They should have to work too. I think that's what his point was there. And then, of course, he's talking about the accident of birth, people who are rich by birth and not by merit, and how that wealth can persist without merit. And of course, that one should share their labors and production with everyone as a whole, which I think is already done through business anyways. But I think I'm not sure how redistribution he's discussing there, but there's a sense in which there's two ways of going at this problem. You either see the problem of poverty as endemic, meaning that, and I don't mean by definition, because that's kind of a silly way to go, but there's either, let's discuss poverty not in the sense of being a relative, but in the sense of being, if there are people who cannot support themselves, cannot survive on their own. There's two ways to go. There's the view that there will always be poverty, and there's the views that poverty is the effect of a system. If you always think there's going to be poverty, then you're going to take the view of there needs to be some kind of redistribution of wealth as a institution, as a policy, because there always will be people who can't survive on their own. And I don't just mean people who are disabled. I mean people who work but can't make enough money. That we're talking about here, because that's a far greater number than people who are disabled and can't work. If you think there will always be people who work but yet cannot survive, then you're going to make institutions to support them. The other point of view is that says that no, bare subsistence is actually not endemic, it's just an effect of a bad system. Then you can just change the system and then you won't have poverty. I don't think Mill's taking that view here. I think he's suggesting that poverty is actually endemic. It's always going to be around. Versus I would take the view that poverty is actually an effect of a bad system, a mixed economy that we have today. And that in the future, I think that won't be an issue because subsistence levels will be so cheap that it won't be an issue. It'll be so easy to obtain food and shelter and all that because it's just so inexpensive. And further down on that page, on 138, he mentions that really to achieve the socialistic end that he was discussing, there has to be a change in human nature. And of course, that's an idea that's been around for a long time. And of course, there's a difference in people's views on that, whether human nature can be changed or not. So he says that we saw clearly that to render any such social transformation either possible or desirable, an equivalent change of character must take place both in the uncultivated herd, who now compose the laboring masses, and in the immense majority of their employers. Both of these classes must learn by practice and to labor and combine for generous, or at all events for public and for social purposes, and not, as hitherto, solely for narrowly interested ones. But the capacity to do this has always existed in mankind, and is not, nor is ever likely to be extinct. Education, habit, and the cultivation of the sentiments will make a common man dig or weave for his country as readily as fight for his country. So he's a social transformation guy. Will simply educate the masses, what he calls educating the masses, but some also might see that as a kind of indoctrination or manipulation of people to further what he sees as a better situation. One thing that I'm not sure about is you would think that Adam Smith's works were around in this time, and John Stuart Mill had considered them. He might know that when one pursues their own selfish interests, which he sees as wholly bad and narrow, I'm not sure why, but they also, as a secondary effect, as a side effect, benefit everyone. So when a business person, let's say someone has a butcher shop, the butcher shop buys cow carcasses, chops them up into meat and sells the meat individually. He's not doing that for the betterment of mankind or to feed the masses. He's doing that because that's his business and he makes money and that's how he survives. But the secondary effect of his meat business, the primary effect of his meat business is his own livelihood. But the secondary effect is everyone gets to buy meat, presumably at a lower price, because in him opening his butcher shop, he's supplying a product that either doesn't exist already or already exists, but the increased supply of the meat will lower its price, and that's better for customers. So these are great things, and I don't know why John Stuart Mill doesn't acknowledge that. He just seems to suggest that any selfish interest is bad, but I don't know why that doesn't seem to be the case. And Adam Smith's work should have been around this time. So here's an interesting point about minorities. This is on page 154. Minorities, so long as they remain minorities, are and ought to be outvoted, but under arrangements which enable any assemblage of voters, amounting to a certain number, to place in the legislature a representative of its own choice, minorities cannot be suppressed. I thought there's an interesting point here that minorities are often the loudest, and I think it's an interesting kind of thought today that the majority of people are often not in the media and not given a voice. It's minorities that get a voice, and minorities try to change opinions. And minorities, I'm not talking about cultural minorities, I'm talking about people of minority opinions. They're the ones that have a loud voice today. If something strange happens and some person is promoted to then speak to an issue, a victim of some kind or whatever it might be, they're then put on a TV show or some kind of talk show or the news, and they're given a platform to speak their minority point of view. But very rarely is there a time in which the majority, the average, the common view is espoused. It's rare to see that. You're often berated on TV, odd and radical opinions of a lot of different things. The very kind of traditional and common view is rarely found. And he's kind of saying here is that minorities should never rule, but they can't be suppressed in a democracy. And I think that's a good way of putting it. We don't want minorities to rule because there's tons of minorities. And if that were the case, if we have a rule of the minority, then we would always be it would be a very erratic and unstable society. There is a virtue in having a constraining force, a slowing force on social change and government, as opposed to the radicalizing influences of minorities with their own, or you can call them special interest groups or lobby groups, same thing. They all have their own little interests, and they are all unstable if they are allowed to take over every now and then. But as Mill says, they're not to be suppressed, and they aren't suppressed, and that's also a good thing. Well, on page 157, he's talking a bit about what should be the structure of government, and he says here that first raised by Bentham, Jeremy Bentham, I think it might be, that although he says that Bentham doesn't quite make the most adequate case or discussion of it. He says that the most important of all public functions, that of legislation, is a particular case of the great problem of modern political organization. And this is what he thinks it is. The combination of complete popular control over public affairs with the greatest attainable perfection of skilled agency. He says, is the biggest problem. The greatest problem in modern political thought, for him at the time, I guess, was how do you combine, in a sense, democracy, popular control, with those who are informed, the bureaucrats or the skilled politicians, or not just the politicians who tend to be panderers, but I mean that knowledgeable people, political scientists maybe, philosophers, how do you combine the skilled few, but retain popular control? That is very hard, because you get in history you get the bad cases of both when they're both in power. You get the radical democracies where popular courts and of ancient Greece, of Athens, in which ostracism was a majority vote, and that's it, you're out. Enough people hate you. So if you're a Justin Bieber and people hate you in a radical democracy, they could just have him hung. And it would be a 51% vote, and that's it for him. That would be a radical democracy where popular opinion rules. But what was supposed to check, it's called checking popular opinion, is a judicial branch of experts. So judges, Supreme Court judges, who are supposed to be very knowledgeable, and in some cases they are, and in some cases they're certainly not. In some cases they're foolish. They're supposed to be the check on popular opinion by way of not, and this is the major error, not their prejudices, but their upholding of a constitution, of a piece of paper. They're supposed to be agents of a constitution, defenders of a constitution, not just an oligarchy, which is the major error of Supreme Courts of today. And so that's the other side. The other side is you have rule by experts like Soviet Russia and communism and in other oligarchies and despotisms and dictatorships in the world. You have rulers, although those are often by kings, those are often by blood, not by experts, by traditions, or by religion. You have rule by a few who are supposed to know more and be more moral or more knowledgeable or wise than the common masses, and thus they're in control. So you get the oligarchs as one wing of the extreme, be ruled by experts, such as in communism, and you get the radical democracies, which are ruled by popular opinion and punishment by ostracism and firing squads. Those are the major poles, the major errors, and where Aristotle certainly knew all about all this. And you can look up in Aristotle's Politics where he actually grades the systems and he shows where the problems are in certain aristocracy versus democracies and monarchies and all these things. He shows the various corruptions of forms of government. But again, like John Stuart Mill is saying here, that there's this major difference between there are virtues in having popular influence, and there are virtues in having expert influence. How do we arrange these things so as to make a balance and a stable society? A brief point on page 174, he says that if you want to, this is in a period of time when he was being considered for office for the British Parliament, and he says that if you ever propose ideas to the public, always try to act as if your ideas are the middle course. And so he says here, induce them to approve of any change. It is necessary that they should look upon it as a middle course. They think every proposal extreme and violent unless they hear of some other proposal going still farther. And I see that as pretty common today, that often when political parties are fighting each other for public approval, they will label other parties as radical or either stupid or radical in their views. And they're always trying to fight for representing the average person, the average citizen of the country, that they represent their interests, and they're not radical, and they're not going to make any big changes. I think a lot of people forget that the average citizen of a country tends to be a kind of conservative, and I don't mean that necessarily politically. I mean that they don't want a lot of change. They just want to be left alone, depending on the country. They want things to be a smooth ride. That's all they really care about. They want things to be regular. They don't really want any sweeping changes. They don't want a big war. They don't want big spending. They don't want big cuts. Like this thing, people tend to be unsophisticated politically, and they just want a smooth ride. They want a job and a smooth ride, and that's it. And so the tactic then, politically, is to condemn your opponents as being radicals. And radicals make big changes. And big changes are often feared by people who don't want big changes. They're trying to create a stable existence for themselves, and they don't want to be fearing what the government's going to do next. So I thought that was interesting that John Stuart Mill talks about that as a tactic.